I was kept in a small office with 3 police people who refused to speak to me. I was tired and frightened. When we left the room, they led me down what seemed like endless flights of stone stairs, dimly lit with 60-watt bulbs. I thought I was being taken to a dungeon somewhere. Then we came to some doors, and a policeman kicked one of them open. I immediately thought they were going to interrogate me, so I clenched my teeth hard. Suddenly there was a flash of light in my face. I was in that cell for the purpose of having a police photograph taken.
This crowd, gathered outside Hyde Magistrates Court in October 1965, had come to see Myra Hindley and Ian Brady committed for trial. 17-year-old Edward Evans had been found murdered in their house. There the police found clues, which led them to 2 shallow graves on Saddleworth Moor. In the first lay 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Nearby, they found the body of 12-year-old John Kilbride.
Well, hanging's too good for them.
Well, it's too quick.
It is. They want to torture them.
A tooth for a tooth.
And a life for a life.
They should take a life for a life.
35 years on, the police cells where Myra Hindley's arrest photograph was taken have been abandoned. Like the picture and the story of the Moors murders, they seem frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the past. Today, Myra Hindley is probably still the most hated woman in Britain, and the current Home Secretary, like his 4 predecessors, is unwilling to free her. The House of Lords is in the process of deciding whether this is lawful. But how did she come to take part in these terrible crimes? Maybe, if we understand that, and why the Moors murders have never faded into history, we can decide whether people like Myra Hindley can ever be freed, or whether some crimes are so terrible that the people who commit them should die behind bars.
It is always wrong not to seek to understand. Again, people will not see that when you seek to understand, that is not because you wish to condone or even to forgive. It's not your or my place to forgive anything in this event. If you're religious, it's only for God to forgive. If you're not religious, it's only for the people who have suffered directly from these acts to forgive. But it is up to us to understand, because understanding is a way towards knowledge and a way towards working out what makes the human being what he or she is. What makes him right, what makes him wrong, what makes him function, what makes him descend into a disorder and into this kind of hell. If we don't bother to understand, then we live in some kind of chaotic morass of just hatred and vengeance. And I wouldn't feel happy living in a world like that. Ignorance is never preferable to understanding.
As a journalist, I'm not allowed to interview Myra Hindley, but I can question her through letters, and she is allowed to make the occasional phone call.
Duncan, it's Myra. All I want to say to you is that I've gotten your letter, thank you very much, and the envelopes. And I'll be starting the next episode later on today and get them off to you early in the week. That's all.
2 years ago, I began to question her about her life. The words in this film have been drawn from 150 pages of letters. She received no payment for writing them and had no control over how they were used. They're read by an actress.
Dear Duncan, I'm using first-name terms since there is likely to be a lot of written contact between us, and it makes the situation less formal. I was born in a working-class area of Manchester and lived for most of my life with my grandmother, although my parents and younger sister lived in the next street. My father, who was not all bad, was a disrupting influence in my childhood, in that after working all day, or sometimes on night shifts, he spent most of his time in the local pub drinking, and never failed to come home drunk. I detested him because of the way he beat my mother, which was often. As soon as we heard the first raised voice and the inevitable noise of fighting, we used to rush in, and my gran would hit him with a rolled-up newspaper, and I'd cling on to his legs and try to get him off my mother.
Like any child, Myra Hindley was upset by the fighting at home, but she believes that her reaction was extreme. She retreated into her own private world, the same way she withdrew from the normal world when she met Ian Brady.
From a very early age, I learned to hide my feelings. I refused to cry when my father was hitting me, or when I drove my mother to hit me too, although afterwards I would run round to my gran's, lock myself in my bedroom, and cry into my pillow. Though it was a survival tactic at the time, so to speak, sometimes I found it hard to express my feelings, and in retrospect, this was a fatal flaw in me when I met Ian Brady.
I think there are clues here in that she describes her father being tough and abusive towards her mother, but she never gave in to that. There's no evidence that that damaged her, certainly not in the material that I've read anywhere. She withstood elements of what might be construed as abuse. And I think, on balance, the evidence is that she's a tough-minded, independent-minded woman.
I asked Professor McCulloch to examine Myra Hindley's letters because he has a detailed knowledge of the Moors murders. For several years, he was Ian Brady's psychiatrist. He says that while the letters are of great value, they have to be read with care.
The letters are, of course, only what Myra Hindley wants to write, and therefore have to be approached with considerable caution. One has to look at what is there and what is missing.
I was sociable, had lots of friends, loved all kinds of sports, went to local dances, the cinema, played truant a lot from my secondary school because I felt like a fish out of water. I later regretted all the lost opportunities. It was a very good school, and in spite of my record of absenteeism, I got an excellent reference from the headmaster before I left to start work at 15. Leaving school and starting work was my dream of freedom, emancipation. I'm not being self-pitiful when I say that those years between 15 and 18 and a half, when I met Brady, were the only years of real freedom I ever had. At 17, I got engaged to a lad I'd been childhood sweethearts with. I did love him, in a teenager's way, and we'd grown close, as friends, and becoming engaged was then the fashion amongst my contemporaries. An engagement ring was a kind of special symbol. Ronnie bought mine from a second-hand jeweller's. We never slept together, partly because I'd been threatened that if I became pregnant without being married, my mother's doorstep wasn't ever again for my feet. The other reason why we never slept together was that neither of us knew what to do.
But the relationship with Ronnie wasn't to last. Like lots of teenagers, Myra Hindley was restless. At 17, she'd already had 3 jobs. Then she went for an interview at Millward's Merchandise, a chemical firm in Gorton, not far from her old school. It was to change her life forever.
Tommy, the boss, gave me a dictation test, and I went next door into the small office, which I hoped would be mine, and typed the letter he dictated. I took it back to him, he looked at it, and his watch, and asked me when I could start. I said Monday, and he said they'd be packing up soon, but first he wanted to introduce me to his colleagues. He said, "This is Bert. You'll be taking quite a lot of work from him." Then turning to a tall man who was standing at the filing cabinet working, he said, "Myra, this is Ian. Ian, this is Myra."
Ian Brady came from Glasgow. He was tall, well-dressed, and seemed full of confidence. But at 21, he already had a long criminal record. He'd done time in Borstal and Strangeways Prison. A very different background to Myra Hindley's.
She found herself sitting opposite a man at another desk who was very, very peculiar to her because he paid her no attention whatever. And he was handsome, he was mysterious, he was quiet, he seemed to have a great deal in his character which he wasn't divulging, and this, to her, became magical. and she became gradually infatuated. He, of course, was Ian Brady, and he was a sadist.
The first year of working at Millward's, in the same office as Ian, was mental torture. Sometimes he would speak to me normally, other times he ignored me completely. I was far too proud to let him see how I felt about him, and never showed how hurt I was when he'd been nasty to me. I wrote everything down in a diary, which I kept locked in one of my desk drawers. Sometimes I would write that I hated him because he was cold and cruel. Other times I would beg God to let him love me in the same way as I loved him.
A sadistic seduction is a very clever thing. If a sadist wants to seduce you, what he does is turn the attention on and off. He took her out once and then ignored her for 2 weeks afterwards. This is the way in which the sadist works in order to make you earn the attention which you are craving.
However sophisticated his seduction methods may have been, the relationship with Myra Hindley began in the mundane circumstances of the works Christmas party. A room had been hired in a pub where people had got drunk. Then they went back to the office.
Someone put the record player on. I was too drunk to remember what was playing, but to my utter amazement, Ian suddenly pulled me up off my chair and began staggering around dancing with me. I thought I would die from being held in his arms, even though he was a lousy dancer, and trampled all over my feet. He walked me down to the bus stop and asked me if I would go for a drink with him that evening. I can't remember what pubs we went to, but we were both drunk. The last bus had gone, so we walked home. He asked, was I letting him come into the house? I said no, my gran would still be up. So we stood on the corner of the street, and he clumsily kissed me. He bit my lip doing so, and I thought, he doesn't even know how to kiss. Then his hands started to go everywhere, but I'd anticipated this and gently fended him off. Then he kissed, bit me again, and said, you don't know how long I've wanted to do this, and walked quickly away. I couldn't believe my ears. I thought it was the drink talking. I went into the house in a daze and sat on the settee, reliving every moment.
Right from the beginning, this was no ordinary relationship. Ian Brady didn't just want her affection, he wanted her to accept his bizarre ideas. She says he took her to see films about the Nazis and told her how much he admired their philosophy and the depraved ideas of the Marquis de Sade. He was obviously no normal man, but rather than reject him, Myra Hindley entered his world.
Brady is intelligent, tall, charismatic, engaging, interesting to talk to, widely knowledgeable about certain areas of life, such as, for example, Hitler and Hitler's speeches and Nazism, and extremely self-controlled, able to dangle one on a string. If he knows that you want to know something about him and he doesn't want you to know, you won't learn what it is you want to know.
Had she not met Ian Brady, then she may never have been involved in... Indeed, this is what she has said in the past, and I see no reason to doubt that. If she'd not met Ian Brady and fallen in love with him, it may well have been that she would have been just continued in her career and got married and had a family and been like any other member of the general public.
Duncan, it's Myra. Can you confirm in a short note that you got my letter and tape, which I posted from here on last Monday, the 21st? Because I'm working on another thing now. I've overwritten the thing I sent you last week. I can vaguely remember where I left off. So I just hope that I've got it right, but it won't be much out. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Before she met Ian Brady, Myra Hindley had been a practicing Catholic. she was confirmed at the monastery church of St. Francis, just down the road from her home. Among the members of the congregation here was the first Moors murder victim, Pauline Reed. Today, the monastery lies abandoned. In her letters, Myra Hindley says Ian Brady demanded she give up her faith.
He scorned me for believing all the crap in the Bible, and for going to church, Mass, with its mumbo-jumbo and incense and confession. It was hypocrisy. Marx was right when he said religion was the opium of the people, a crutch to hobble through life on, because religious people were weak and needed something to believe in, to help them accept the bad things that happened, and there was no afterlife. It was all man-made lies, and you didn't even know you were dead.
In her letters, Myra Hindley says Ian Brady prepared her to be his accomplice over 18 months. He first introduced her to the idea of killing with a book, which reads like a blueprint for the Moors murders. It's divided into 2 sections, Crime of the Century and Trial of the Century. The victim is a child. It even has a character called Myra.
He had given me a book called Compulsion, which was the story of Leopold and Loeb. They decided to commit the perfect murder. They were studying the philosophy of Nietzsche and his theory of the superiority of the pure Aryan and the strong overcoming the weak. It was very much the Nazi philosophy. They kidnapped a 12-year-old boy for a ransom. They killed him, were caught, and sent to prison. I told him it was a very disturbing book, but why exactly had he wanted me to read it? He told me he wanted to do a perfect murder, and I was going to help him.
5 years later, like the characters in Compulsion, she was standing in the dock, charged with murdering children.
I was panic-stricken because I knew Leslie wouldn't disobey me and go away. I knew she'd either been taken or something had happened to her, you know.
One of the children she was accused of killing was 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey.
But even up to them finding Leslie, I still had hope that she was alive, because I didn't think anyone had harmed her, you know. Because she wasn't a child that would cheek anybody to be harmed.
This is the Magistrates' Court in Hyde Town Hall, where Myra Hindley and Ian Brady first appeared. Like many of the places connected with the Moors murders, it's been abandoned, but never demolished, as though no one's quite sure what to do with it. It's here that a recording of Leslie Ann Downey's cries for mercy was first played to a horrified audience, including the child's mother. On the tape, Myra Hindley is heard shouting at the girl to shut up and stop spitting out the gag in her mouth.
The worst part of it was seeing Mrs. West in the witness box, and I was looking at her as she was giving evidence, and she saw me as I was looking at her, and she screamed across at me, "How can you look at me?" And she called me every name under the sun, and it suddenly hit me just what I had done.
The nation was appalled by the suffering of Ann West's daughter. The tape recording of her being abused was the one piece of evidence that could not be denied. Ann West was to spend the rest of her life ensuring this was never forgotten. The Moors murderers only escaped hanging by a matter of weeks. The death penalty was abolished between their arrest and trial. Myra Hindley was sentenced to life for the killing of 2 children and being an accessory to a 3rd murder. Ian Brady was found guilty of 3 murders. Together, they had maintained their innocence throughout and made no mention of the 2 other children they had killed and buried on Saddleworth Moor. Myra Hindley's obsession with Ian Brady was so powerful that it not only survived the pressures of a murder trial, but lasted well into their imprisonment. She even continued to feed his sadistic sexual fantasies, writing him letters in a secret code. It was only after 6 years of physical separation, when she was in her late 20s, that the relationship began to weaken.
I can't remember what prison he was in at the time. He said he could sense from my letters that I was drifting away from him. I really wanted to sever contact with him, for he was still so bitter and wrote constantly. I began to dread his letters arriving, for he began insulting me about my religion. He wrote, "What colour hair shirt are you wearing today?" And, "What slogan do you have round your neck today? Jesus loves you. Do people other than Christians have a hotline to God?" And really nasty, hurtful things, until I finally decided that he'd begun to hate me. So I wrote my last letter to him. It was very short. I just said that we were no longer remotely on the same wavelength, that I was no longer prepared to receive abusive letters, not to write back to me, because I'd asked the governor to return any letters from him unopened.
But even though the relationship with Ian Brady was over, she still did not confess. She also continued to make the headlines. Inside Holloway Prison, she began a relationship with a prison officer and former nun, Patricia Cairns. Together they planned her escape, but the plan was discovered, and the warder was jailed. After this episode, Myra Hindley appeared to become the model prisoner, resuming the education she'd abandoned at 15. She studied humanities through the Open University and got an honours degree. She also learned to play the guitar and entered a prison music competition.
In 1976, before I started smoking and could still sing, I entered 3 songs for the Kersler exhibition and came first out of 500 entries.
How long since I've spent a whole night in a twin bed with a stranger, her warmness all around me. How long since I've gazed in the dark eyes which melted my soul down.
But the relatives of the victims saw all this as an attempt by Myra Hindley to manipulate the authorities. The mother of Leslie Ann Downey, Ann West, was one of those who gave countless interviews to argue against any suggestion of release.
No way can they let them out. If they do, I'll be going in because she'll be dead.
She was a woman. She should have had motherly instincts. She is not human. Devil's daughter. But there's always that little doubt in my mind that one day maybe they will be set free. And that's what's on my mind when I go to bed of a night. My child begged her, "Please let me go. I know what you've done to me and I'll not tell Mummy. Please let me go home to Mummy." She wouldn't do that for my daughter. Do you think I could ever forgive her? The monster she is. She deserves all she gets, that monster. And more, and more.
The hours for once they pass slowly, unendingly by, like a sweet breeze on a field. Your gentleness came down upon me, and I guess I thanked you.
I always hold out some hope for everybody, for everybody, because I think without that, I don't think there's much of a future for any of us. So, yes, evil was there, and you look at what happened, and it was undoubtedly evil. But the person I know today, the person with whom I meet every now and again, we keep in touch, is not an evil person.
But the relatives' anger was fueled for more than 20 years by the fact that the Moors murderers had not admitted their guilt. In 1985, Ian Brady finally confessed to a journalist and told him they'd killed not 3 children, but 5. The police reopened the case and visited Myra Hindley. She agreed to help them find the 2 bodies still lying on Saddleworth Moor, and, after 21 years, she finally made a full confession.
People say, well, why didn't she confess straight away? Well, all these things are a process. We all live our lives in a kind of a process. Things unfold, things are peeled off, fears are taken away gradually, and I think this happened with her too.
and any thought that she might come out, or any thought that she's quite normal, seems to draw forth from people, oh no, we don't want her to be like that. We want to keep her in the evil icon image, this evil monster that we can hate.
Police sealed off the moor to protect Myra Hindley. On the 2 occasions she returned to help them find the missing bodies. Detectives had been over every scrap of evidence before asking for her assistance.
In the course of our review, we had pinpointed 2 areas of the moor that we felt were of interest, if I can use that phrase again. Holland Brown Knoll and Hograin and the Shiny Brook areas, where Keith Bennett's body, we now know Keith Bennett's body is buried. What we didn't know, we thought that there would probably be a body in either one of those or in both of those, but we didn't know which one was where. But we'd certainly highlighted those 2 general areas. And Myra Hindley was able to confirm that those were indeed the 2 areas of interest to us, and tell us which body was buried in which location.
But her appearance on the moor reopened old wounds. The father of John Kilbride, one of the children found in 1965, tried to get through the police lines to take his revenge.
How do you feel about this police operation?
Police operations are all right as long as it let me through. That's all I have against them.
Or if this brings it to an end, would you welcome that? Presumably you would.
Yes, and then you would get hard on them. If you want to see, it's there. I come prepared to kill her.
Despite her visits to the moors, the search was unsuccessful for 7 months. But in July 1987, a late-night telephone conversation between Myra Hindley and the police gave them a vital clue.
We had been wondering whether it was daylight or dark when the body was buried, because if it was in the dark, then it wouldn't have mattered had that gravesite been visible from the road. Whereas if it was done in daylight, then it would. And we thought this might be have some bearing on our search. Myra Hindley replied to the question. It was just going dark, it was dusk. She said, I could see the outline of the hills on the other side of the valley. And to our astonishment, there was only one relatively small area where we could actually stand and see the outline of the hills on the opposite side of the valley. So it narrowed our search area down quite dramatically. And it was really a chance question and a chance answer, I guess. So I have to say, even unwittingly, she certainly helped us there.
After more than 20 years, the body of Pauline Reed had been found. Her funeral service was held at the monastery church of St. Francis, where she and Myra Hindley had attended Mass. Somewhere, Keith Bennett's body still lies undiscovered. Police brought his mother, Winnie Johnson, to the moor to explain exactly what they'd done in the search for his grave. She remained determined that one day he would be found.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm getting back to him as soon as I can, because it's not going to rest here. I don't intend it to, and as long as I draw breath, I'll fight for what is rightfully mine.
The fact that Myra Hindley helped the police find one body did not improve the public mood. Instead, confirmation that she had helped kill 5 children increased hatred towards her. That hatred has persisted. In her letters, Myra Hindley accepts her guilt, but claims that people do not understand the extent to which she was under Ian Brady's influence.
He had such a powerful personality, such an overwhelming charisma. If he'd told me the moon was made out of green cheese, or that the sun rose in the west, I would have believed him. I was so stupidly unworldly, emotionally immature and unsophisticated. I was a dreamer, a romantic. All I'd ever hoped for from a relationship with him was marriage and children, but it wasn't to be. He used to take pornographic pictures of me, telling me to smile and pose and look as though I was enjoying it, sometimes using the timer on his camera. He took some of both of us and told me to take some of just him. We often drove up to Saddleworth on his bike during the day and at weekends and sometimes at night. We used to climb to and over the big rocks where he would tell me he was going to practice carrying a body, tell me to make myself as limp as possible. Then he'd hoist me up and over his shoulder with my arms and head hanging over one side, and my lower body and legs over the other side. The blood used to run to my head until I was going to faint.
If Myra Hindley thought this was just a game, the seriousness of it soon became clear. He told her he wanted her to find him a victim. She was to pick up a child in her van, drive to Saddleworth Moor, and wait for him in a lay-by. She says she was reluctant to help him carry out his fantasies.
I parked the van against a wall and just sat there. I did see a few kids, some on their own, and it was easy enough to do what he'd told me, but I just couldn't. There was no way I could do it. I went in and told him I'd tried, but couldn't find anyone whom it was safe to approach. He said he'd seen me parked in the van against the wall. He said I'd have to try again the next day, Sunday.
She went out in the van, and, once again, failed to pick up a child. But whatever her doubts, she still went home to Ian Brady.
He went mad. Didn't I realise that kids were told not to talk to or go with strange men? That was why he needed me to pick someone up, because I was a woman, and a child would be more trusting of a woman. I burst into tears, and he slapped my head backwards and forward, and began strangling me. I managed to fight him off, and told him to stop it.
Myra Hindley says Ian Brady then tried to scare her into doing what he wanted, by drugging her with sleeping tablets. She claims he also drugged and threatened to kill her grandmother. It was only then she made an attempt to escape.
I knew I had to get away, for both my sake and that of my family. I secured an interview with NAFI headquarters in London, who were recruiting for people to work for the British forces in Germany. I got the job, in spite of feeling that I'd failed my medical. When I got back to Manchester's Piccadilly train station, Brady was waiting for me, which I didn't expect. We drove home in silence. He stripped me, gagged me, and beat me with a cane, raped me anally, which he often did because he knew I cried with the pain and hated him doing that to me. Then he turned me over and urinated inside me. Before leaving, he warned me that if I ever tried to get away again, I'd be the sorriest person alive.
Although she describes in her letters how she was beaten, drugged, and raped, Myra Hindley says she stayed with Ian Brady because she did still love him. She enjoyed his company, and they spent days out together just like any other ordinary couple.
I must be totally honest and say he wasn't always cruel and sadistic towards me. We had some pleasant, relaxing times in country places that he'd found in travels on his bike. We'd pack a picnic lunch, flasks of coffee and bottles of wine, and spend whole days in a peace and tranquillity that was such a contrast to the other side of him. These were moments I treasured and thought about when things were bad, trying to remember, telling myself that he couldn't help what he was, and maybe in time he would become accustomed to ordinary domesticity, and we could live a normal life.
But all hopes of a normal life for Myra Hindley disappeared on the 12th of July, 1963. That evening, she left her home in Gorton in her van, with Ian Brady following behind on his motorbike. They were setting out to abduct a child.
We set off, and soon saw a little girl on her own across the other side of the road. He flashed his light, but I drove on. He overtook me and told me to stop the van. Why hadn't I picked that girl up? It was an ideal opportunity, with virtually no one anywhere near her. I said she was 8 years old. Her name was Mary, and she lived next door but one to my mother. He grudgingly agreed that I was right to drive past, to carry on down Froxmore Street, and to watch for his headlamp light. I saw a young girl walking down the street on her own, with nobody else in sight. He flashed his light, and I slowly drew up just behind the girl, opened the passenger door, and called to her to ask if she could spare a minute. She turned round, and to my horror, it was Pauline Reed.
The circumstances in which Pauline Reed was abducted were extraordinary. They were just a few hundred yards from where Myra Hindley lived with her grandmother. 16-year-old Pauline was a friend of her sister's, yet she picked her up, knowing she was going to be murdered.
I knew I had a choice. I could either just wave at Pauline and drive past her, in which case she would have lived, and I would have to endure the consequences of Brady's rage. This all happened in split seconds. I made the choice of having to sacrifice Pauline so that my own family would be safe. I felt sick with fear and self-loathing as I asked her if she wanted a lift.
Myra Hindley says that she asked Pauline, who was on her way to a dance, whether she would help her look for a glove she'd lost on the edge of Saddleworth Moor, 20 miles away. She claims Pauline Reed went willingly.
As I write, I can still feel the same emotions as I felt then. I knew she would never get to the dance, or any other dance, ever, for I was driving her to her death. As we approached the lay-by, it was still fairly light, but with very little, if any, sun. He arrived in what seemed like seconds. We both got out of the van, and I told Pauline this was Ian, and to him I said, "This is Pauline. She lives quite near to Grand's, and is a friend of Maureen." He ignored the implications of what I'd said, and smiled at her. He said to Pauline that they'd start making their way up the bit of a hill, and I stood for a moment watching them.
She says that as she watched Ian Brady lead Pauline Reed away, she knew she would never see her alive again. But Myra Hindley didn't try to stop Ian Brady, go for the police, or run away.
Supposing I phoned the police and they came and nothing had happened upon the moor, both he and Pauline would say they were looking for an expensive glove and were waiting for me to join them. The police would think I was some kind of crank. We would have to go back home, dropping Pauline off at the dance hall. And I shuddered at the consequences. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard a scrambling noise and looked out of the passenger seat window. It was Brady. He asked me if anything had happened, and I said no. Then he told me to get out and follow him. He led me to her body, which I tried not to look at. I didn't know at the time he was testing me, and that there was no need for me to be there. He told me to look at her. I'll never be able to forget what I saw. I stood and looked at the dark outline of the rocks, against the horizon of the dark sky, and 3 people died that night. Pauline, my soul, and God. No God would let what had happened happen.
Pauline Reed was buried in a shallow grave on the moor. She had been raped, and her throat had been cut.
She does say that with Pauline Reed she was taken onto the moor and saw the body, perhaps not yet dead, but certainly an extremely unpleasant sight. Whether she was there or not at the time, I don't know. But she was certainly there at the immediate aftermath, and that is one of the most distressing things that can happen to anybody. People of a more nervous disposition or less fortitude become completely disintegrated. They deteriorate in terms of depression of mood, they become anxious, they develop a syndrome called post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course was seen in Vietnam veterans, was seen in the Hillsborough victims, and is seen in any extremely serious threatening situation. There's no evidence of any of this in these letters.
We didn't speak much on the way home. Both of us were lost in our own separate thoughts. Then he said, "If you had shown any signs of backing out, you would have finished up in the same grave as she did." I just said, "I know." At last we reached home. He took off his overcoat, said there was a bit of blood on it, so I'd have to take it to the dry cleaners tomorrow, and systematically began to cut his clothes up and burn them in the fire. He made me get the spade and scrub it thoroughly in the sink, so that every trace of earth was removed. He saw me reaching for a pair of washing-up gloves, and told me not to be so effing squeamish. It was only earth. I said I wasn't touching it with my bare hands. I felt like hitting him with it. I wasn't having grave dirt down my fingernails.
They didn't argue for long. In fact, they'd made it up within 24 hours.
He'd bought a bottle of Drambuie to celebrate, and he sat down next to me on the settee, sipping his drink, and saying after all the years of dreaming of it, he'd actually done it. He'd committed the perfect murder. He asked me how I felt about it. I told him I'd never in my wildest dreams imagined that something like this could have happened, and began to cry. He stroked my hair. I thought the merest touch would repel me, but in spite of what had happened, this new tenderness touched the core of my heart and flooded it with all the love and emotions I'd felt for him for so long. We fell asleep on the settee, with his arm still round me, and my head on his shoulder, and this time I slept deeply from sheer exhaustion, the drink and the crying, and there were no nightmares.
Had it not been for, and I think Myra Hindley would be the first to admit this, had it not been for the fact that she was involved, the children, it would have been unlikely that the children would have gone along willingly with Ian Brady on his own, as it was, with a couple, with them working together. All the children, all the young people involved, went along quite readily and accepted the stories they were given to effectively abduct them.
These children went to her with trust in their hearts, and she betrayed that trust. And that is something which cannot be forgiven. The fact that this good Catholic girl should so smother her normal female responses as to be part of this wickedness is what makes the case unforgettable.
Shortly after the first murder, Myra Hindley began a relationship which could have led her away from Ian Brady. It was with, of all people, a policeman. He'd called round, offering to buy her van. They used to meet while Ian Brady thought she was at night school.
I knew without a shred of doubt that if I'd met him before I met Ian, this man would be someone very special in my life. We went dancing on the Friday night, and that night we did make love, and we both wept as we held each other afterwards. He asked me to finish with Ian and go out with him. He wanted us to get engaged and married when we both felt it was the right time. I had an overwhelming desire to tell him everything, even though it would mean the end of he and I, but realised I just couldn't.
Incredibly, during this relationship, Myra Hindley even applied to join the police force herself.
I went to Mill Street for an interview and was considered suitable for training and given forms to fill in. When I told Ian what I'd done, he thought it was hilarious. Then one weekend in November, just after I'd passed my driving test, we were sitting watching something on the TV, and he calmly said to me, "I want to do another one." I asked him another what. What he'd said hadn't penetrated my thoughts. My thoughts were so filled with Norman. "Another murder. What did you think I meant?" He said I wouldn't be involved, except to help find him one, and get it into the car. I said that was being involved. He told me he was becoming bored with me. By bored, he meant his patience was running out, and he wanted a child for 2 reasons. The first one was he wanted a child. The second one was because Pauline Reed had struggled too much, and he'd had a hard time doing what he did, and he wanted someone smaller. I felt sick with loathing. I knew I had to do it, and hated him, and hated myself even more. I thought, this is the kind of life I'm going to have to live. This is my whole bloody life. I wish I could stop loving him. I wish I'd met Norman before him.
But Myra Hindley decided to stay with Ian Brady, and 4 months after the first murder, they went looking for their next victim. This time they went further afield, to a market in Ashton-under-Lyne, on the edge of the moors. Ian Brady's planning was meticulous. He told her to get a black wig to cover her blonde bob. They drove across the Pennines to Huddersfield in Yorkshire, where she bought the murder weapon, a knife.
The child looked up as we approached him, and I said what he'd told me to say. and that bastard actually said that we had children of our own, and we would worry if one of ours was out in the dark on his own. The little boy readily accepted a lift.
Like Pauline Reed, John Kilbride was driven to Saddleworth Moor and, as planned, raped, killed and buried. In the end, it was the fact that Ian Brady was so organised that led the police to the bodies. Not only had he written detailed plans of how to dispose of incriminating evidence, he'd taken photographs of where the children were buried. Myra Hindley claims that at the time she had no idea what he was doing.
He stopped me as I was walking and said to turn round, moved me about a bit and told me to kneel down and look at Puppet, whose head was showing from where he was still wrapped inside my coat. I now know, and knew quite soon afterwards, that he'd photographed me virtually kneeling on John Kilbride's grave. I'd become an emotional wreck, and I knew then that there must be a callous streak in my nature, a cruel streak even. There must have been something in me before I forced all the rottenness out of myself, or as much of it as possible over years and years. And I still don't know what it was rooted in, or where it came from.
I don't think that an ordinary person could be altered by the influence of somebody like Brady, or indeed specifically by Brady, in a short period of time, if at all ever, to be able to do all those things that she did with Brady and to assist him in the way that she did, without having an extremely tough personality which was not upset by what she was being asked to do. I think that people have features to their personality which require to be brought out by circumstances, and I think that Brady's knowledge, attitude, personality, what he was doing and thinking and what he wanted to do had this effect of bringing out the, if you like, cruel, determined streak in Myra Hindley.
Myra Hindley says that between abductions, she and Ian Brady would secretly watch children at play, the behaviour of paedophiles. Keith Bennett, their third victim, like John Kilbride, was just 12 years old. He was picked up as he walked from his home to his grandmother's house. Again, Myra Hindley asked if he would mind helping them, this time with carrying some boxes. He was taken to the moor, raped and strangled. As with the other victims, she says she didn't witness the killing.
She always says she was a little bit away or in another room, and I think she does accept that the very fact she was in close proximity and that she'd been involved in the abduction of the children, then she was as guilty as he was. But she does say on each occasion that she wasn't physically present when the murder took place.
In September 1964, Myra Hindley and her grandmother moved to Hattersley on the outskirts of Manchester. The following February, Ian Brady moved in. Their home, which stood in the gap between these houses, has been demolished by the council.
I thought she was a smashing girl, and I knew her pretty well owing to her my daughter being very friendly with her, and she was very good to the other children. Any promises she made, she always kept. I didn't think Myra was the sort of girl that could do anything to harm children or anything, because I thought a person who loved animals as much as she did would be incapable of, and she made such a fuss of children.
In her letters, Myra Hindley writes that shortly after the move to Hattersley, Ian Brady said that he wanted to do another killing.
He said this time he wanted the child brought back to the empty house so he could take photographs, which you could later sell. The same tactics as before were going to be used.
Leslie Ann Downey was taken from a fairground back to the house in Hattersley. What followed, and the tape recording of her pleas for mercy, have embedded this case in people's memory. it is also the one killing Myra Hindley is still unable to deal with today.
I'm finding it very, very difficult to do this Leslie and Downey thing. I think I'll have to be as brief as possible. There was that tape, which isn't what people think it is, but it's bad enough, and I just hurt so much to think that I could have been such a cruel bastard.
I have heard the tape of Leslie Ann Downey, and it has Myra Hindley's voice on it. There's no element of that tape which betrayed any sympathy towards a little girl who was plainly in great fear. No sympathy whatsoever. It's the only situation where there's independent evidence of Myra Hindley's presence and complicity, and is arguably the most sensitive point against what she's seeking to argue. And therefore I think its absence from discussion in the letters is extremely meaningful.
Shortly after Ian Brady and Myra Hindley moved to Hattersley, they were followed by Myra's sister Maureen and her husband David Smith. They moved into a tower block just a few minutes' walk away.
Ian learned all about David's quite violent past, all his dissatisfaction with his life, the grudges he nursed. They had so many things in common. It came as no surprise to me when I finally learned that David had been recruited, had become almost as slavish a disciple as I was.
Myra Hindley helped Ian Brady to pick up their final victim, Edward Evans, from a railway station in central Manchester. He was taken back to Hattersley and battered to death while David Smith was in the house. But the crucial difference between Myra Hindley and her brother-in-law was that within hours of the killing, he went to the police to tell them what had happened.
The next morning I knew I had to bring my granny a cup of tea, because if I hadn't, it would have been out of the routine. So I just made the tea, and there was a knock on the back door, and I was in a state of total shock. I opened the door, and to cut a long story short, it was a policeman dressed in a baker's uniform, or his jacket and hat, and it had Sunblessed on the pocket. The first thing I said was, "You've got the wrong house. We have Mother's Pride."
35 years after the arrest of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, the emotions attached to the Moors murders are as strong as ever. Keith Bennett's body has still not been found, and while his mother, Winnie Johnson, and the other relatives of the victims maintain pressure on politicians for her to die behind bars, Myra Hindley herself continues to challenge the Home Secretary's right to keep her in prison.
It would certainly, I think, be more helpful if there were a set of legal rules and if this was dealt with in a legal context rather than politicians becoming involved in it, because it's such a high-profile case, it makes their decisions so much more complex and so much more difficult.
The prosecutor, Elwyn Jones, said that she had been indoctrinated and corrupted, said that she was an accomplice, not a perpetrator. And the judge who passed the verdict 2 days afterwards wrote to the Home Office, and I've written down what he said because I think this is 1966, it's 33 years ago, but it's been forgotten. Judge Fenton Atkinson wrote to the Home Office, "Though I believe Brady is wicked beyond belief, without hope of redemption, short of a miracle, I cannot feel that the same is necessarily true of Hindley once she is removed from his influence." And that was the judge himself at the time of the trial. That has been forgotten, and it's quite the opposite has happened. It has been assumed that she's increased in wickedness over the years.
Last week, the Law Lords heard Myra Hindley's latest appeal. They will now rule on whether decisions taken by politicians about her continued imprisonment are lawful. In 1982, the Lord Chief Justice, Britain's most senior judge, recommended that she serve at least 25 years. Since then, successive Home Secretaries have first increased that term, then ruled that she should die behind bars.
Nobody wants to say anything which is going to be unpopular, and it seems that in the way we think about Myra Hindley, the first thing that seems to come into a lot of people's minds is just the recycling of the hatred and the hostility and the projecting back, sending it all back. But I don't believe, finally, this brings out the best of what it means to be a human person. And I think that hatred and hostility and revenge-seeking actually gnaws away at us. It eats away at us. And it actually corrodes our own spirits and our own beings. And I don't think that draws out what's best about being human. And I don't think, if I can put it this way, that we should volunteer to be more victims of Myra Hindley in that sense.
She wants sympathy of the people so she can get a reprieve from prison. And that she'll never do. Because the people of Manchester alone won't let her do it. And if she steps a foot outside that prison gate, she'll be dead before she gets 2 yards away from the prison gate. Because there'll be somebody waiting for her, no matter where she goes or what she does.
In her letters, Myra Hindley, who's now 57, writes about the pain the Moors murders continue to cause. She says that at times she's thought it would have been better if she had not escaped the death penalty.
I knew I was a selfish coward, but I couldn't bear the thought of being hung, although over the years I wish I had been. It would have solved so many problems. The families of the victims would have derived some peace of mind, and the tabloids wouldn't have been able to exploit and manipulate them, as they do to this day. My own family, although they would have been devastated, both at my being hung and the reasons why, would have come to terms in some way, not completely, in time, and would have been spared all the suffering they endure to this day. I would have made a total confession to the priest before I hanged, and wouldn't still be half crippled by the burden of guilt that will never go away. But I didn't hang.